Welcome to the next episode of Navigating Carbon, your compass to carbon management. As always, I'm your host, Deb Ryan, and in this episode, I sat down with John Eichberger. John is the Executive Director at the Transportation Energy Institute, a non-profit research group dedicated to evaluating the issues affecting vehicles and fuels markets. TEI's comprehensive, fact-based research is really led by their diverse board, who are designed to answer questions and not advocate for a specific outcome. John and I discussed the unique role that TEI plays, given that it does sit at the intersection of the fuels markets with company participation across the entire fuel supply chain. TEI's position allows them to find this healthy balance in their research between decarbonisation in the fuel space, at the same time also focusing on supply accessibility and affordability of fuels. To stay on top of all upcoming episodes, please make sure you like and subscribe to the channel. But for now, sit back and enjoy my conversation with John. Hey everyone, and welcome to the next episode of Navigating Carbon. Today, I'm joined by John Eichberger. John, how are you?
I'm great, Deb. How are you doing?
Good. I'm really excited about a conversation we're going to have today. You're the executive director for an organization called the Transport Energy Institute, or TEI. We haven't talked a lot about transportation fuels on the pod, so I'm excited to dive in and stuff.
Shame on you.
I know. It's long overdue.
Come on now.
I know.
It's the one element of the industry and the market that every person has some familiarity with.
Yeah, which is where I'm actually really excited to dive in and sort of pull this apart, right? Because the fuels conversation at the moment, like you said, everyone is impacted by it. Like we all drive or have some, even if we don't drive ourselves, we have access or exposure to transportation in lots of different forms and stuff. So for folks that aren't familiar, can you take us through who is TEI, and a little bit about the history and the evolution of it?
Yeah, so the Transportation Energy Institute will be 13 years old in a couple months. So we are a full-on preteen moving into middle school drama that goes along with all startup nonprofits. We are a nonprofit research group. We were founded in 2013 as the Fuels Institute, and we always said fuels was all energy. We had electric, we had natural gas, whatever it was, we didn't care as long as it moved surface vehicles. And then politics got ahead, and if we're trying to educate members of Congress, and they think fuels is dirty, they're not going to open up a report by the Fuels Institute. So we changed this. Okay, well, transportation energy will be that. Anyway, we are led by a board of more than 60 organizations that range from oil companies to biofuel companies to electric vehicle charging companies to natural gas companies to engine vehicle manufacturers to distributors and retailers of energy products to National Lab Engineers, American Lung Association, NASCAR, you name it. It is a melting pot of perspective on the transportation sector. And the reason we do such a broad, diverse board is they're a peer review panel. And we want to be a fact-based, objective voice for issues facing the transportation market. When you have enough people who strongly disagree on topics, I can guarantee we're not going to be able to be biased. Yep. Which gives me great comfort when we publish a paper and we look at it, okay, what are we really finding here? I am very confident that that the results are not skewing one way or another. Which I can't say for a lot of reports I read.
Yeah. Because you are based in DC, aren't you? So you are, like you said, you are putting out reports and stuff like that. Like, what are some of the main kind of research pieces that your members and that people are looking to you guys for to get that really unbiased opinion? Like
so when we changed our name, the board also says, look, we love we're unbiased. We love we don't advocate. And we do not advocate. But what do we stand for? When you're not advocating, it's kind of hard to say, this is what we care about. And so the board came and said, look, the global objective is to reduce carbon emissions. Okay, we're not going to get into is that the right thing or the wrong thing, but we want to evaluate what's the best way, most effective way, and efficient way to do that. At the same time, we don't want to increase air pollutants that cause respiratory illness. We want to be looking at carbon for the long term. We also want to look at air quality in general. But the fundamental basis here is no matter what we do, if it is unaffordable to the end user, it will fail. And so we're looking at how do you do this in a way that actually makes sustainable economic sense. because that's the only way you're going to actually get meaningful change in the market that delivers the environmental emissions objectives we're trying to achieve is if it is still affordable. And we're not just talking about affordable for those in Palo Alto buying $100,000 EVs. We're talking about inner city Chicago. We're talking about Native American tribes. We're talking about rural America. You can't have a broad brush and go, everybody in America, everybody in the world can do this, because that's wrong. It's
Yeah.
completely short-sighted and misses the fact that we are a very complex society, and we need solutions that fit everybody's needs. And if we can get solutions that fit everybody's needs that are progressing towards lower emissions and affordable, then we're going to accomplish a ton of good for the market. So that's
Yeah.
kind of where we are. We really focus on that type of
I love that.
approach.
There's so much to unpack with what you just said, because I think the fuels conversation, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the different types of regulations around fuels that we've seen and stuff. But like, there's business to business fuels, because it's huge industry, whether we're talking about airplanes or shipping or fleet and stuff like that. But as we talked about at the top, like I fill my car up like I don't know every few weeks or once a week, depending on how much I'm driving and stuff. And it does impact people's pocketbooks and like
Mhm.
our actual spending and stuff. And I think the conversation around the evolution of fuels, and I love the framing of how you were talking about that with how the Transport Energy Institute sort of evolved as well around that conversation. Because I think fuels get there's such an interesting label that goes with that, right? Whereas we're seeing this conversation like evolving pretty substantially, particularly around like how we're going to power AI and other things. But like
Right.
it's still fuel and stuff. So I'm curious with, you mentioned you guys are 13 years old, right? Like other than just the name change and how people sort of view fuels generally, like how have you seen the evolution around the fuels conversation and what's really sort of stood out to you over that, and whether that's the last couple of years or like broadly over the time of TEI? I'm curious kind of, yeah, how that's changed.
So I'm going to bring my true nature to this conversation because before we started TEI, I was a lobbyist.
Hmm.
So I have a very strong cynical vein in me. And I like to say we've seen this movie before, The Pendulum Swings,
Yep.
and we're seeing the pendulum swing again. It was interesting. We started the Institute, natural gas was going to be the next big thing. Everybody's looking at natural gas for medium heavy duty passenger vehicles. We're I was getting calls every week. Hey, John, should I offer natural gas at my fuel retailing location? It was a great economic boon, and then oil prices tanked, and natural gas lost its luster for the time. There's a big market for renewable natural gas now, but what I think we found is this swing from come out of the recession in 08, 09, economy, energy independence, that type of thing, and then we move into Paris Accord and the global focus on reduce carbon emissions at all costs, which, first of all, is one of the dumbest statements I've ever heard, because if it's unaffordable, it won't succeed. So
Yeah.
we have to take care of families. We have to take care of people and their need to eat. But the shift, all policies shifted to climate first. And I started seeing some fissures in that climate first mindset when the Ukraine war started. And European Union, well, whoa, we're coming up on winter. We don't have enough natural gas to heat our homes. And this idea of energy availability is really critically and fundamentally important to society. Okay, so how do we make sure we have enough energy resources to satisfy society's needs and growing needs while protecting the environment? And we started seeing a kind of a rethinking, kind of a shifting of the bar stools a little bit. And then you progress to last year's election and the Canadian election, and you see this complete shift in some leaders to move away completely from climate to energy and economy as a whole. But when I look up in Canada, I think that's a great microcosm of what we're seeing. By all intents and purposes, the Liberals should never have won that election.
No, they
Okay,
shouldn't have.
external
People were
policies
annoyed at people were
External
annoyed at
policies.
Trudeau and
Oh yeah, external policies gave Carney a lifeline,
yeah,
and Carney's come in and look. Carney is a fundamental. He believes we need to address climate
yeah,
change, but he's also saying Canada has to become a global energy superpower.
yeah,
And so you're starting to see this mindset of environment and economy, environment and energy, and that's where we need to be.
Yeah.
And so right now, the pendulum's swinging, I think, in some markets to kind of balancing out. In the US, no, it's like left and right as far as you can go. But the real solution comes down to how do we deliver solutions that make sense?
Yeah.
And they
And
have to be environmentally sensitive and they have to be economical, otherwise they will fail. And I think that's where we're starting to see more reality in the leadership. They're starting to be a little more pragmatic, hopefully, and hopefully that brings us better solutions.
yeah. This is partly why I've been so excited to sit down and have this conversation with you, because I think you and I do view this very similarly, right? Like, it's like, okay, yes, we need to think about efficiency and decarbonization and emissions and stuff, but it can't be at the expense of, if it's not economic, it won't get adopted.
Right.
But if there's market solutions in this space, it'll sort of transcend politics a little bit. And so we won't see these wild swings, and it'll just be like, that's the way we do things now, because that's what makes sense financially.
Right.
So it's, I think the intersection and the fact that you're working with so many different groups, I think is so fantastic in that. And I think going back to what you said about Canada, it's been interesting. I know a lot of folks, particularly in Calgary and Alberta and stuff, who are obviously very involved in the oil and gas industry and stuff like that. And it's a lot of them were very concerned about Carney coming in, and a lot of them have actually been really pleasantly surprised
Yeah.
that he is being very open to having some of these, sort of very balanced conversations that are pretty necessary. And I think, again, interesting as Canada's trying to figure out how they export their products to places other than the US and stuff like that as well. So it'll be interesting to see how
I
that kind
think,
of
when
evolves
we
as
think
well.
about our political leaders, and here's just two examples of what we shouldn't be doing. We can't pick one solution.
Yeah.
We can't close off the discussion. So in the Biden administration, I had an individual tell me the story, went to meet with the Secretary of Energy and want to talk about renewable diesel. Great product for reducing emissions from the medium heavy duty vehicle space, which is 25-30% of transportation emissions. And he was told, no, we're not talking about liquid. If it's not talking about electrification, we're not talking about it. Okay, well, that's cutting your nose off to spite your face. We have 1.5 billion vehicles in the world that are internal combustion engine, need liquid fuels, and we're not going to talk about them. So putting all your eggs in one basket of electrification is a bad idea. Putting all your effort saying we're not even going to talk about emissions, we're not going to talk about climate, we're not going to talk about any of that stuff, that's a bad idea. We have a lot of smart people in society and in industry who have solved a lot of challenging problems in the last 100 years. Good leaders bring smart people together to solve problems. The market has plenty of room for electric vehicles, has plenty of room for low carbon liquid fuels, has plenty of room for natural gas. It is a big, enormous market, and we need all those solutions. And hopefully, we'll get to a point where we can have the electric vehicle advocates, the natural gas advocates, the biofuels advocates, the petroleum advocates, and the vehicle advocates sit in a room together and go, all right, guys, how do we do this?
Yeah.
And that'd be a fascinating conversation.
Yeah, it really would be, because this is where like transport does bring together all these groups in a way that other sectors don't. The other sectors are all so isolated,
Right.
and don't have to talk to each other. Whereas particularly in the transport space, we're seeing that sort of conversation being forced a little bit. And the refusal to acknowledge liquid fuels, whatever form it is, right? Whether it's biofuels or, and I say low carbon, fossil based, where people can prove and verify, low emission carbon intensity and stuff. The fact that, this sort of notion that we're just going to take all the internal combustion engine vehicles, whether that's fleet or individual vehicles, and throw them out,
Like that,
and
quickly.
it's like, that's not, it's never going to happen. Not, it takes a long time for that sort of capital stock to turn over, whether it's an individual buying a new car or, a company replacing their entire fleet. Like, it's not a good use of capital. So it's like, it
Right.
becomes a really challenging conversation. So like, as you guys are looking at and working with all these groups in different parts of the sector, like the decarbonization piece, like where are you seeing some of the interesting kind of technologies and discussions around transport? And you mentioned kind of before as well that, different solutions, obviously are going to work in different places. It's something I've talked about a lot as well. Like, yeah, what are you kind of seeing as you're talking to your members and your board around the decarbonization piece?
Right. So I think one, like electrification is not over. Some of the headlines 3 years ago were ridiculous and aspirational and completely not rooted in reality. The headlines now make people think, oh, it was just a fad, it's over. That's not true. So electric vehicles are going to continue to gain market share, and they're great technology for the right market, the right people, but they're not zero emissions.
No.
Just because they don't have a tailpipe does not mean they're zero emissions, and that is a huge misnomer. So even if we replace every vehicle in the world with electric vehicles tomorrow, which is impossible, is not going to eliminate emissions. And I think that's something that needs to be eradicated from the lexicon of discussion. But there are huge opportunities on low carbon liquid fuels if you take a life cycle approach. So we did
Yeah.
a study on how to decarbonize combustion vehicles because it was a topic that wasn't getting enough attention. And what we found is you can bring renewable energy resources to the oil field and the refinery. You can use sustainable agricultural practices to reduce the carbon intensity of your feedstock and use renewable energy for the biofuels refinery. You can use carbon capture, sequestration, utilization to take the carbon that is emitted because you can't avoid all carbon emissions and use it in a way that recycles it so we're not adding more to the atmosphere. And that all combines into a lower carbon liquid fuel.
Yeah.
Now, if we can change the blend ratios and tweak the formula a little bit to have a low carbon petroleum, a low carbon ethanol at 15%, maybe splash a renewable gasoline, which is a byproduct of renewable diesel, maybe at some point bring in a little bit of e-fuels, you start ratcheting that carbon intensity down. Now throw it into a hybrid vehicle. And
Yeah.
your life cycle emissions is so much lower than an electric vehicle using the current US grid. And that is a solution that doesn't require any infrastructure change for the consumer, requires no behavior change for the consumer. And we need consumers to buy the new vehicles and the new energy. The only way to make sure they do that is one, it has to be economically advantageous for them for mass adoption, not those first movers, but for mass
Yeah.
adoption. It has to be easy and it almost has to be imperceptible.
Hmm.
Because they don't like change. We used to talk about, okay, how do you get the customer to buy E15 at the dispenser? We need to explain to them what E15 is. No, you don't. Because they don't want to know.
Yeah.
We want to make sure it's compatible and they want to know, is it cheaper? Is it okay for my car? And then they'll buy it because it's cheaper. Once you try to tell them, hey, this is new, this is different, this is the second highest investment of my life, second only to my house, my vehicle.
Yeah.
I'm not putting something that I'm not comfortable with or I'm not familiar with. And so we need to take advantage of the familiarity. And that really is the direction we have the conversation with. So our board gets together every quarter and talks just what's going on. The election hit, we've convened several times since then. I've asked them, okay, so are your long-term strategic plans going to change? And to a T, they're going, no, our long-term strategy doesn't change.
Hmm.
Some of our tactics and our implementation timelines will evolve based upon relaxed regulatory structures or market realities, but we are not turning our back on carbon emissions as a
Yeah.
long-term objective. We're not. Some might, but in general, the leaders in the market are not. And so it is still interesting to watch that the market is adjusting to political realities, but is still looking down the road. Where do
Yeah.
we need to be? Maybe take a different route to get there now because we can, but we're still going to get to that point. And
Yeah.
that's exciting to see that we haven't lost that focus.
Yeah, no, it's really good and it's really reassuring because I think there is a lot of people, and there's been a lot of talk about things like the endangerment rollback, endangerment
Right.
rollback and stuff, which would impact the transport sector and stuff like that. And it's good to hear that people are like, no, we are going to stay the course, and it's yes, might be able to be there's less regulation and timing changes, but it's not just like throw it out, start again. The piece you mentioned there that I think is really interesting is like on the consumer side of like people just not seeing that change, right? Like, and particularly then on the cost side, because there's been a lot of conversation about um, like something like sustainable aviation fuel, for instance. And I realize individual consumers aren't buying sustainable aviation fuel, but sort of biofuels more practically. That SAF is way more expensive than traditional jet fuel, and that's so it's like bringing down some of that. But I think it will be interesting to see. Like, I don't know. Do you think if there is like a slight premium on lower carbon fuels or something that's got a higher blended, biodiesel portion in it because they are at the moment more expensive? Do you think price alone will drive people away if it isn't cost competitive to have some sort of blended low
So
carbon fuel? I don't know.
you
Like,
have
what's
to
your kind of your thought around
you
that?
have to split the end user,
Mm,
passenger vehicles, rank and file consumer. We've surveyed them for years. Hey, would you spend an extra 25 cents a gallon for a lower emitting fuel? Oh, absolutely. Would you spend 50 cents a gallon? Absolutely. I want to protect the environment. I will invest. And they pull up to the pump. The only green they care about is in their wallet. They're
Yeah.
not going to pay more for an environmentally sensitive fuel. A small portion will, but mass quantities will not. They hate buying gasoline. They hate buying fuel. They despise the companies that produce it and distribute it just because that's what they've been taught. They think they're taking advantage of me and they don't like spending the money. And so they're going to buy the cheapest they can unless they're in this special class of customer that thinks differently. Where you have a different mindset is in the fleet customer. The customer buying most of the diesel-based product. Because if they are doing business with a large multinational corporation that has a net zero pledge or some sort of carbon reduction plan, they're being held to account by their customer to
Yeah.
participate in that life cycle carbon emissions mitigation. And so they may say, I will pay a little bit more for renewable diesel. I will pay a little bit more for biodiesel so I can demonstrate to my customer that I am with them and supporting them in that effort. And in a commercial setting, you can adjust your business plan, your pricing strategy to accommodate a slightly increased cost of fuel. Families can't.
Yeah. That makes
So
sense.
it's not like I'm going to be able to increase the cost my daughter pays me for her room that she lives here when she's 11 to cover my cost of fuel. Not going to
Yeah.
happen. I could increase the price of a delivery by a couple pennies to offset. So there is a better opportunity, I think, to be a little bit more aggressive on the commercial side than on the
Yeah.
passenger side. But even then, and one of the things we point out is when you change the economic calculus for a business, you affect not just that business, you affect all their customers and the community they serve.
Mm.
The ripple is a lot bigger than the cost incurred by a family. And so we have to be conscious of that. And that's why finding the right solution for the right business case, and when we talk about commercial, I always say it's not about miles per gallon. It's not about grams per megajoule. It is, but it comes down to work rate. If I
Okay.
replace this vehicle with vehicle B, and that vehicle B can only do 60% of the work on a charge or a load of fuel that vehicle A could do, I now need two vehicles.
Yeah.
You just dramatically change my economics and you increase congestion on the roads.
It's true. Yeah.
And people don't think about those
No.
side effects.
Yeah. I think that's a really, because again, the idea of like, particularly on the liquid side, like if we can keep, there is a piece around like even just replacing like an internal combustion engine with the newer version of the same one, like there's an efficiency gain on emission side. But at the same time, like if we can keep like internal combustion engines or ICEs on the road longer because there's decarbonization solutions, one, it helps, yeah, that piece around like it helps the company in terms of that huge capital investment for a new truck or new whatever it is, a new van or whatever. It's a really interesting kind of piece as well around like, yeah, there's these sort of flow-on effects. Like stuff's not so binary and it's such an integrated kind of piece around this, which is really cool.
Your comment about longevity of the vehicles. Look, an average new light duty vehicle is $49,000 to $50,000. Not very many American families can afford that, which
No.
means they're going to hold on to their legacy vehicle longer until they can afford something, which means if we don't pay attention to the fuel that legacy vehicle is using, we're not making any progress on emissions controls.
Yeah.
And that's why this whole idea of let's just electrify everything and convert everything just drove me nuts. Like, yeah, I love electric vehicles. I think they're a blast. They're wonderful technology. They are a huge part of our future. But you know what? We can't replace our way out of our emission situation.
Yeah.
It just can't happen. We're not going to be selling 17 million vehicles a year anymore, not at $50,000 a pop.
Yeah.
And so we need to find solutions that affect the fuel that's being used in legacy engines because we're not going to be making modifications to those vehicles. So the only thing we can modify is the energy they're consuming.
Yeah. So the other piece that like on the sort of flip side of this as well, like as you guys are sort of thinking about not only the affordability, but like what does it mean in terms of like access to solutions and stuff for people? Like is it and does that vary kind of like around the country or like between here in the US in terms of like like I'm curious kind of what that looks like as well in terms of, if people want to be able to do these things, whether it's a company or an individual and stuff like that. Like I'm curious what kind of you guys have looked at on that side as
So
well.
I used to use the term before it became so politically charged equity,
Mm.
because in my mind, equity means equitable access to affordable energy in the transportation space. And I always point this out. Very few people recognize the United Nations still has what they call World Toilet Day, to draw attention to the fact there's nearly 1 billion people in the world that don't have indoor plumbing. There are more than 1 billion who don't have electricity service in their homes. I use that just to point out that one size fits all solution does not work.
Yeah.
And that's globally. In the United States, I mentioned it before, you have tribal lands, you have rural America, you have inner city America, you have suburban, you have high rents communities. They're not all the same, and they can't all shoulder the same burden of cost. And that's why we need to make sure that we have solutions. And there was a time when fuel prices spiked, and a government official that will remain nameless, you can Google it and find it pretty quickly, just said, well, if they can't afford gasoline, just buy an electric vehicle. Okay. That was one of my favorites.
Well, and just to jump in, the irony of this as well is that, there was an election, we've just had an election. It's obviously off year election and stuff like that. But like energy prices is something that has come up. It's not a climate conversation and stuff like that, but the cost of electricity. So like even if people could afford to go and buy an electric vehicle, they know that it's going to be more expensive than to charge it and stuff like that anyway. So it's just
Yeah,
it cracks me up.
it's a solution that just doesn't apply to all situations. And so we look at it, if I'm living in a economically disadvantaged community, and all the signs are telling my local gas station that your business is awful and you're not going to have a business in 10 years. And my underground storage tanks are 30 years old, 35 years old. And I go, oh, I may lose my insurance unless I replace them, because my insurance company may say that. I'm looking at $1 million replacement of my underground storage system. If you're telling me my market's drying up, why would I do that?
Yeah.
Now I close down. Now that economically disadvantaged community has no local access to fuel. If they can't fuel their vehicles, how do they get out to a job? How do
Yeah.
they improve their situation? So we really need to be thinking about, on an equity standpoint, how do we make sure that all communities have access to affordable and reliable transportation? Now, some will say, well, they just need to use mass transit. If you're in certain communities, mass transit ain't coming.
Yep.
So your only access is to walk or to have low price fuel so you can move and travel around. And we need to make sure that people don't get locked into where they are because they can't afford the energy. And so we
Yeah.
need to stay laser focused on, okay, what is the affordability metrics we're looking here? And what I love, Argonne National Laboratory has a platform where they're looking at the energy burden of transportation in different markets. It's a fascinating resource to understand,
Mm.
okay, in some markets, the price of energy is 25% of their household spending. In other markets, it's 3%.
Wow. This is
Now you
such a
put
big
that in
difference.
context, you go, okay, now I understand that nickel a gallon actually makes a difference to some people.
Yep.
And when you're a policymaker and you're living in Washington, D.C., oh, it's just a nickel a gallon. Who cares? Well, for some people, it's make or break. We
Yeah.
have to pay. We have to remember that.
Yeah, it makes sense. And it is, like particularly in sort of more rural communities and things like that, like where people do have to drive further. And again, it costs more to just fill the tank because they're doing it more often and stuff like that, where like people in high dense cities might not even have a car at all because they do have, so they can afford more on rent or whatever it is. So
Yeah.
it's really interesting when we look at affordability broadly across like what that means. Because even in, you talked about for companies then with the ripple on effect of some of this as well, like the delivery of then like food and stuff to those communities becomes more expensive. And it's just this like compounding problem. So it's not just then them trying to get out, it's also stuff trying to get in as well, which
In
is,
rural
yeah.
America, the local gas station is often the center of the community.
Mm.
It's part grocery store, it's part restaurant, it's part gas, it's part. When they can't survive, the community may have to drive 30 miles to find gas.
Wow.
And so if we're not thinking about those customers and those consumers, we are missing a big part of the equation to figure out how do we sustainably provide energy in an affordable and economically progressive manner. We have to stay focused on all that. And some people say, John, you're just making it complicated. No, I didn't make it complicated. It
No.
got that way all by itself. I just like to
Yep.
point it out.
Yeah, right. And it's again, when we go back to affordability, I think it's such a simple, because we all feel it in different ways, and it means different things to all of us, but it does matter. Like it's a big piece. So I want to kind of pivot. Final kind of thing I want to touch on. You mentioned that, you've got past life, excuse me, past life as a lobbyist. So I want to talk a little bit about some regulation kind of stuff, because we've got regulation here in the US with like the low carbon fuel standard out of California, and now other states are doing it, and like Oregon and Washington as well. And we've got some international regulation. The IMO had put forward their net zero
Yep.
plans. They didn't pass. There was a lot of conversation about that, but again, the International Maritime Organization putting rules in place around, again, how ships consume fuels and the types of fuels and stuff like that. Like, I'm curious kind of what you're saying. Like, we've talked about affordability, but like, what role do you think some of these low carbon sort of fuel regulations, whether it's, again, at the state, national, because Canada has a national one, like what role do you think they play, or do they play a role in like this whole story around
I
fuels and stuff?
I think when you're transitioning to something new, like a low carbon fuel program or market, the cost of entry is high. And so in those circumstances, government programs help move progress along, whether it's an incentive program or a low carbon fuel program like in California or the CFR up in Canada. Um, all of that said, I'm not a big fan of regulation. I'm a free market guy. There's a role for government to encourage and support and maybe push a little bit the market towards an objective that's good for society. There's punitive regulations, and there's those that are actually constructed to move the market along. At some point, however, the government can't run it all. There has to be an economic return on the investments businesses are making. Take electric vehicle charging. Yes, there's government programs to help support the capital expense to install chargers. If I'm a retailer and I'm looking at that, that's great. So you offset 50, 60% of my installation costs. What are my operating expenses?
Hmm.
And if I can't pencil out a return on my investment, I'm still not going to spend the $300,000, $400,000 I have to spend if I'm not going to make money on it. So we need the market to show signals to the industries to invest in the low carbon options, to invest in low carbon fuels, to invest in carbon capture, sequestration. The government can help get that started and get the momentum started, but there has to be a path to where the government starts, kind of like parents. We raise our kids, and then we hope they can go sustain
We
their lives on
send
their
them
own.
off.
Please go fly, be successful. We want you to be successful, and that's what government programs should be like too. We've gotten too reliant on government programs.
Mm.
And I think, there's this whole conversation about what's the value of carbon. Some governments have assigned a value for carbon. It's transparent, I guess. Some like it, some don't. Maybe there's a rule for that in some markets, maybe not. I'm a bigger fan of the voluntary market. And whether that takes off or not, we'll see. But here's my theory on the voluntary. I had a conversation with a friend of mine. I said, "Oh, it's just paper shenanigans. It's a shell game." Well, no. If I'm in a business where I want to reduce my carbon emissions, but it's really hard for me to do it because the nature of my business it's carbon intense, and it's going to cost me $1 million to reduce a ton of carbon.
Mm-hmm.
But Deb, you have a company you can reduce a ton of carbon for $50,000. So you're going to do that, and I'm going to go, okay, I'm going to buy credits from you. Well, what's credit? Credit is an investment.
Yeah.
You're going to sell me a credit. I'm going to pay you money so you can keep reducing carbon emissions, and I'm contributing to the life cycle global carbon reduction. Because I can't reduce my emissions without hurting all my customers and possibly going bankrupt. You can. So if I buy credits from you, I'm investing in your more efficient carbon emissions reduction technology. Yeah. That's where we need to go. We have to have a united objective where we want to be and what's realistic and what's achievable, and then let the market self-sustain it. Now, will it? I don't know. Maybe that's why the government needs to be involved in the early stages. But that's the goal, in my opinion.
Yeah.
If we can get we can get industry to understand that investing in lower carbon technology is good and can be efficient and effective and benefit bottom lines across the board and benefit the end user, I think we're going to have a pretty successful path to having a much cleaner transportation sector in the future.
Yeah, I love that. And I think the piece that I think is really cool about this as well is that as the conversation around lower carbon fuels and the transportation decarbonization generally, like, I don't know, I'm hopeful maybe that we can actually also maybe change some hearts and minds of people as we talk about, and I say people, the general public, right? I might be delusional in that a little bit, but like, I think as the energy access conversation and the energy affordability conversation is becoming front and center here, particularly in the US. I think it is sort of forcing the conversation a little bit about, okay, well, let's talk about where your energy comes from and why it might be more expensive and some of that kind of stuff. And, maybe we can have a more balanced conversation. I don't know. Maybe I'm hopeful on that, but
I
we'll
told
see.
you, I told you earlier that I'm extremely cynical. That's after spending 20 years working in and with government. But I'll tell you, in the last 13 years, watching the members of the Institute come together, set aside their differences, and actually talk about what are the opportunities in the market, what are the
Mm,
challenges in the market. And they're not vying for primacy in the advocacy agenda because we don't advocate. They're just sitting there actually talking and
mm,
learning from one another. And I had a board member early on tell me and tell his executive team that the first meeting he came to is so angry. So all these people are here. They're talking about my business. They're not in my business. What are they doing? And then I finally shut up and listened and realized we're all serving the same customer. And I started talking to them. We have a lot more in common than I thought we did.
I love
That
that.
actually gives me hope. And as a born and just a trained cynic, it's very uncomfortable, but I agree with you. I do think there's an opportunity. I do think there's hope.
Yep.
We have to stop this political crap. We have to stop. If you don't agree with me, then you're evil. No, if
Yeah.
you don't agree with me, fine. Let's find something you do agree with me on that we agree upon and work on what we agree on. Maybe we can resolve some of the differences of opinion later. But right now we're in this, it's all or nothing. You're either with me or you're my enemy.
Yeah.
And until we get over that, and I see it happening every time my institute gets together, I see that happening. I see the potential for what we can be if we take politics out of it.
Yeah.
But that's not hopeful. That's
It's hard.
Pollyannish.
Yeah.
So we'll see.
I know. But it's exciting and I think, like you said, I think we're starting to see, the shift around conversation to things like affordability, that it's okay, we can all agree that we need to find affordable solutions. And I think that's it's a good start. So
Mhm.
I don't know. I'm slightly optimistic, we'll see, but like it's all
I'm
good.
cynically
So
optimistic. How's that?
I love that. I love that. John, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Anytime I love talking about this stuff.
Great. Thanks.
Thank you.